All right, what's up, guys? We're going to look at consumption today, the negative and the positive externalities. We'll start with the negative externalities, though. So keep in mind, as we compare consumption versus production, consumption relates to anything that the consumer does. So, for example, consumer drinks alcohol, something bad happens. A consumer smokes cigarettes, something bad happens. The consumer takes vaccinations, and other people don't get as sick. The consumer gets educated, and the society as general does better. These are all externalities from the consumer side. The producer side would be like factories producing steel, or the schools being built, right, by educational institutions. That's producer side. So right now we're focusing on consumer side. So therefore, when we are looking at externalities for consumption, the producer side, so the marginal private cost equals the marginal social cost. These two have no differential. Whereas, for example, if we are looking at, let's say, negative externalities, we have what the benefit is for the individual. So we'll call this the marginal private benefit. So that is where the free market meets. Right? This is where the free market meets. So we'll call this the price for the free market, and the quantity for the free market meets. But then we separately have, as a society, we are worse off because beyond that individual transaction of, let's say, for example, the companies that sell the cigarettes and the people that smoke the cigarettes, we have the rest of society having a lesser benefit. And that's expressed here with the distance between these two curves, which is precisely the negative externality. In this case, if it's smoking, it could be things like lung cancer. It could be things like people missing work, right, from being sick, people dying when they're dead, they can't work. These are all examples of a negative externality, etc., etc., etc. Right? There are people that aren't consuming the product yet are getting negative. So again, that space between is representing the negative externality. Now, as a society, we want to be where the societal cost and the societal benefit meet. So we want to be at this point right here. So that is price, which is optimal, and that is the quantity, which is optimal. It also might be quantity star or price star, depending on a document that you're looking at. So we want to be here, but we're actually here. So let's finish off this graph, which is to now label the dead weight loss. So to find the dead weight loss, we first find where the societal meets the societal. And we know that right now we're at this point here right now. So the rest is pretty simple. It's just fill in that empty spot, this area here. This is representing the DWL, right? The dead weight loss, what we do not have and what we want to eventually get to is to this point, right, where society. So government cares more about society, right? They don't care about people purchasing the cigarettes or the individual cigarette companies. So their goal now is to somehow shift this curve so that we can get to an optimal quantity, which is lesser, right, than what we actually provide with the free market. So we can actually move either the demand or the supply curve. So let's start with the more simple one, the demand curve. The demand curve, we have to figure out how can we shift it to the left. How do we do that? Well, we do that with negative advertisement, right? And we actually see most governments do this. So cigarette companies have to have little labels that say things like cigarettes will kill you. If you smoke, your lungs are going to look like this. So because of these negative advertisements, it does in fact shift the demand, right? The consumers don't want to smoke as much. So in theory, we end up with lesser amounts of quantity. Now, the other way we can shift this is through shifting supply. The way we can do this is we can shift supply by banning or regulating the goods. So for example, saying, hey, cigarette companies, you can only sell this much, or alcohol companies, you can only buy this much. So the way that would look like would be shifting the supply curve to the left. I'm trying to make it straight here. I don't know why it's not going straight. That's fine, but you can still tell the curve, right? It's to the left. So what would be doing that? Things like regulation, things like taxes, right? By decreasing supply, we now have a new equilibrium here. So we'll call this P2, and the new equilibrium here is still the optimal quantity. So last point I want to make about these things, regulation and taxes, is you'll notice the high prices. Well, these high prices are things that obviously the private, the people selling it, Marlboro, right, and other cigarette companies, they don't like that, right? They're saying, hey, people are going to buy less cigarettes. But keep in mind, from the point of view of the government, they're fine with these higher prices as long as they've been able to decrease quantity, right? As long as less people are smoking, mission accomplished. And I was going to add one more thing. Let's say these taxes. Keep in mind, the government takes this money, and what do they do with it? Well, hopefully they're not going to use it to buy a baseball team or like a soccer team. What they would usually do is then use this towards something related to things like lung cancer, cigarettes, right, research. And that connects back to what we've been talking about for the past 3 months or so, CLASP, right? That it comes back to evaluation of where that money is being used, and that will also dictate whether or not the people are going to be willing to pay these extra taxes and whatnot. So that concludes negative externalities of consumption, sort of graph stuff. I'm going to look at my PowerPoint now, and then later we'll move on to the positive externalities of consumption. Hey guys, so this is a continuation of negative externalities of consumption, but just kind of going through my notes. So some of this might be a little redundant, but no worries. So reminders that negative externalities of consumption are things like cigarettes, alcohol, single-use plastics. So the consumer uses it. That's the key thing, right? The consumer uses it. However, it's not just negatively impacting them. Secondhand smoke is making people sick. The drinking's not just getting them drunk, but they get in a car accident and hurt someone else. Junk food, you might be thinking, oh, that doesn't impact others. It does, right? Others will have to pay for their health care because they have diabetes or whatever. Now, other key points for negative externalities. So in this case, the benefit for society is lesser than the benefit for the private individual, right? So it looks a little something like this. I think we just drew this a second ago. But the key point here is that the MSC and the MPC are equal, right? They're the same, but the deviation happens with the benefit, right? With the consumer side. And what this is illustrating, don't really look at this as left and right. Look at it more as up and down. Look at it as the marginal societal benefit is below the private benefit, right? It's below. Therefore, it's a negative externality. Now, how can the government respond to this? They could do things like just simply get rid of this product, right? This product's not good for society. Let's ban it, right? We've done this for things like cocaine, heroin, right? It affects other people as well. The one negative with that is black markets arise, right? Cocaine, again, would be a great example of that, where it's illegal, but tons of people are still consuming it on the black market, in the United States at least. So another issue with this is that, politically speaking, it could be a dangerous issue. As I've said to you guys before, big thing with consumers is they don't want to be told what to do, especially American consumers. So you're always running a political risk when you ban any product, because people feel like you are taking away their freedom. And taking away people's freedoms, negative impact could mean maybe I'm not going to be elected in my public position. Here are 3 examples of how governments have reacted to negative externalities and their results. 1, drugs. This has been mixed, right? Certain things were banned. Marijuana is a great example of mixed, right? Where some states had it banned, some didn't. Some said medicinal is okay, some said Medicinal's not okay. And overall, we've seen black markets, but we've also seen, when it was legalized, certain amount of regulation being successful. So it's kind of hard to say with drugs. Depends on the drug too, right? Now, plastic bags have actually been a tremendous success. When places like the EU set bans, in the beginning, people were not very happy, right? 3 months, 6 months, right? People are like, I got to bring my bag to the supermarket. But eventually, I think a lot of these were passed about 10 years ago. But nowadays, people kind of regularly just bring their own bags, right? So it's been a real success with plastic bags. And alcohol is the opposite, a real failure, especially in the United States, where the US government said, hey, look, this product's no good, right? People get drunk, it's highly connected to domestic violence. People could be doing drunk driving, right? People might be drinking all day, then they can't work. There's all these negative things about it, so let's ban it. The problem with this was people continued to consume it on the black market, so now the government is not getting any of the benefits they had from the taxing the product. Now, what can the government do? They can also tax the product. By taxing it, their supply will shift to the left. They have less money for things like laborers, paying for properties, capital, etc. And you'll notice by shifting the curve to the left, right, now our quantity is lesser. The price is high, but that doesn't matter. The problem with this is that these type of products like alcohol and cigarettes, they're highly addictive, so people might pay for it anyways, and it might really hurt their wallets. Another thing we can do is shift the demand curve, make people less prone to consume these goods. So we've all seen this. If you go to any airport in the world and you see duty-free cigarettes, very often these cigarettes will have these advertisements on them saying, hey, if you smoke, you get lung cancer, or your skin gets messed up. And these are all examples, right, of negative advertisement, trying to dissuade the consumer from purchasing items. So in other words, we're trying to move that MPB to closer to the MSB in order to decrease quantity. So this is an example of a anti-drunk driving ad. I'm not going to play it because of copyright, but you can kind of imagine, right? Governments will make things like don't drink and drive. And the problem with these type of things is shifting demand costs money. Commercials cost money. You got to hire the actors. You got to get a director. You got to get airtime, right? So it all comes back to unit one, right? Opportunity cost. Is it worth the government to spend this money and time and effort for advertising? All right, let's go ahead and talk about positive externalities now. So positive externalities coming from the consumer side. So I've already talked about what those examples are of the negative. So with positive, what we're looking at are things like people going to the public library. So they get knowledge and they can share it with other people. We're talking about having things like museums and galleries and people consuming that good and now being more cultured. People getting early years education, nursery provision, which then helps their parents, be able to work and whatnot. So keep in mind, it's on the consumer side. So the way this looks like is the opposite of what we just did with negative externalities. So we have two curves for demand or benefit, and the marginal societal benefit is greater than the individual, right? And that's represented with this space between the private versus societal. As you can see, the societal goes up, right? It's greater than the private. So let's go ahead and finish this chart up. So we have first the free market equilibrium. So that's where private meets private. So that would be over here, where the free market is saying, hey, we should have this quantity, so QFM or Q star. And then over here, we have the price free market or price, not star, Q1 or price one. So this is where we're actually at, but where we want to be as a state or as a country or city is where MSC meets MSB, right? Because we care more about society from the point of view of a government. So from the government's point of view, they're saying, hey, it would be nice, Q optimal, right, or Q star, if we had more of this good. And then we have the price optimal here. as well as our price star. It's the same thing, price optimal, price star. So last thing to finish this diagram up is figuring out where's the dead weight loss. The dead weight loss is always pointing in the direction of MSC and MSB, so right here. And we know that with the free market, we're right now at this amount of quantity. So one could deduce based on those facts that this area here, this space, which portrays the potential gain we have here, right, that we could potentially get from this point to this point, which is the potential welfare gain, PWG. Now, we have our chart set up. So what else can we do here? Well, we can talk about how to move it and what it means. So in this case, our goal is to get here, right? This quantity right here, to get to this point. Actually, let's do another color here. We'll make it in yellow. So my goal is somehow to get our quantity to be at this point. And the question is how? Well, I can do this two ways, through demand or through supply. So if it comes to demand, I could simply just try to shift demand to the right. How can that be done? I can shift the demand to the right through things like marketing, right? Advertising. So we saw this take place during COVID-19, right? The government was spending money to hire celebrities to tell people, hey, go get vaccinated. And if more people want to get vaccinated, eventually the goal is we move this private market's demand to meet the point to where it helps society, and boom, we have optimal amounts. Everyone is happy. Now, the other way to approach this is supply side, to impact the producers. So if we can shift the supply curve, we could also increase the quantity. So what would we have to do? We'd have to shift it to the right, right? We would want greater amount of quantity, so greater amount of supply. So we'll call this MPC plus the subsidy. So with a subsidy or direct provision, I'll put that in here too, or direct provision, I can shift this original supply curve to the right, right? So if it comes to subsidies, maybe I'm giving money to the company so they can hire more people, maybe buy more land. Direct provision is if as a government I said, hey, you know what? We need more vaccines and private companies aren't pulling it. We are actually going to go ahead and use our own government facilities or government people to provide this extra bit. And what does that do? It shifts it to the right, and now we have this new equilibrium right here. And you'll notice, means the price is cheaper, we call it P2, but over here, the quantity, which is what the government cares about the most, is at the point we want to be at. So by moving supply to the right, so again, that can be done with things like subsidies or direct provisions, we now have this new equilibrium point with a higher quantity. So that's it in regards to diagramming for these things. I'll have 2-3 more minutes here at the end. I'll add on of me lecturing using my slides. And that's it with externalities, guys. The positive externalities of consumption. So positive externalities of consumption. So again, think of the consumer side. The consumer goes to museums and is a bit more cultured now and can spread that culture to the rest of society. The consumer eats free meals and now they're a little bit healthier and they can participate in the workforce, right? So this is the idea that the consumer can consume something, but other people that are not consuming that original good are also contributing. So in regards to diagram, it looks kind of like this, where we have the free market is here, yet the societal optimal amount is over here, right? Therefore, this is the potential welfare gain, right? We want to get from this point to over here. We want more of the quantity. So in what ways can the government do that? One simple way is just subsidize, right? If it's, for example, schools, give the schools some extra money. If it's vaccines, give extra money to centers that do vaccines. We increase supply, which increases quantity. The problem with this is it costs money, right? The government's got to pick and choose what to subsidize in. And of course, people are going to be picky about this. They might even get mad. A great example is the airline companies. After COVID-19, the airline companies got $54 billion. That's 54 billion with a B. That same year, we had CEOs taking in millions of dollars of salaries. In fact, Gary Kelly from Southwest Airlines, $9 million. Even those companies losing tons of money and they're taking government handouts. Obviously, people don't like that. The second is direct government provisions. This is where they directly provide the goods. So if it's, for example, something like nurseries, and there's just not enough, instead of paying money to corporations that provide nurseries, governments can go in and say, hey, we're just going to actually set up our own nurseries, and that will obviously push it to the right. Now, the issue with that is governments are often less efficient. We see this often with the examples of public schools. A great example of that is New York State. I think the average student gets $24,000. I mean, that is, as much as an elite private school, yet most people would say public education in New York State is definitely not the same level as like good private schools. So often governments doing it themselves have that issue. Just kind of some extra interesting information. In 5 industries with government heavy involvement would be things like healthcare, education, transport. Ones where we don't see much government would be like luxury goods, fast food, right? We don't see like the California state fast food restaurant, right? We don't see the New York, or we don't see Missouri luxury bags, right? And there's a reason to this, because the government is going to focus on spending things that mean the most to people, like healthcare, transportation, right? They're not going to have time to make nice leather bags of Missouri, right? Nice leather bags of Oregon. This doesn't make sense. Now, the last way the government can try to shift the amount of quantity is government advertisement. So this is where government tries to increase the demand curve, right? Get people to sign up for whatever they're trying to sell. That will shift demand and overall shift the quantity. One last one here is legislation. So governments can, for example, and this happened during COVID, they said everyone needs to get 2 shots. And even if they couldn't do that, so in the United States, for example, it couldn't be mandatory, but there's kind of sneaky ways to do it. So a sneaky way to do it would be like, you must have 2 shots in order to enter like a public building. You must have 2 shots if your kid wants to go to the public high school, right? Public elementary school. These are examples of legislations trying to push people to buy more quantity. Now, yep, those are the main points there. Again, I'm kind of zipping through it because I've already talked about it in the graphing earlier. But yeah, that's it with the consumer side of positive and negative externalities. And I'll wrap it up. Sorry, that video was a little longer than I anticipated.